So this is going to go over the second half of the PowerPoint on empire and the commercial revolution. The commercial revolution was a period of European expansion, colonization, and mercantilism. So a lot of the things that we've been studying in this exploration chapter, this is a period of time when Europeans just really expanded their reach in the world, and along with that, their economic activities. So this spans multiple time periods. Historians would say it started in the 1200s all the way through the 1700s, where because of this huge growth of European empire, there was innovations and expansion in the economic tools that Europeans were using. This is the general path that European expansion took. They started with exploration, leading into developing new trade routes, and eventually into colonization, or actually moving people to these new places. So we'll see in the commercial revolution, there was a growth of banking and investment, and also the growth of towns and new social classes or new elites that were able to get ahead because of these changes. So the price revolution was a period of inflation or upward movement of prices in the 16th century in Europe. It was probably only 2 to 3% inflation, which today is considered very low. That's considered just a normal rate. But we have to remember at this time, most people were still subsistence farmers, and any kind of price change was very dramatic for them, and they definitely would have felt that because they were only ever barely getting by in life. No one can determine what caused this for sure. It's possible that as the population of Europe increased and there was an increased demand for food because of that increased the prices for food. So to give you an example, in 1400, following the Black Death, Europe's population was about 60 million. By 1600, 200 years later, it was 100 million. So that may have put a lot of pressure on prices and food production and caused inflation to occur. Also, a lot of Spain's most productive farmers and businessmen had been Jews or Muslims that had been kicked out of Spain during the time of Ferdinand and Isabella during the Reconquista. And so Spain had eliminated a lot of its most successful economic producers, and so that may have hurt their economy as well. Another theory is that silver imports from the New World caused this. So the Spanish, especially in Latin America, had these enormous silver mines. A huge amount of silver flowed into Spain. You can see the statistics here. And so that's essentially like printing more money, okay? If we print more money in the United States today, it would cause the value of our money to go down. People didn't understand economics at the time like we have people that do today. And so they didn't realize the toll that all this silver coming into their economy would cause, because it seems like a great thing to import silver, but it actually could have caused this inflation. So why didn't the government fix this? Leaders like Philip II of Spain did not have a good understanding of economics at the time. And like I said, they didn't realize that importing all this gold and silver would cause their money to be devalued. They also didn't increase taxes. And so as they were expanding their reach in the world, the government could have really been benefiting from that. But they didn't really understand, again, how that all worked and the economics of it. And so over time, they were taking in the same amount of taxes, but now because of inflation, that money was actually worth less. And so Spain was bankrupted several times under Philip II and other Spanish leaders. Spain also became dependent on many of its manufactured goods coming from Northern Europe. At the same time that they are expanding throughout the world and colonizing and spending all this money on their military, they also were not focused on developing their own manufacturing because they just bought their stuff from other places. And so Spain just really started on a downward kind of trend. We talked in this time period about Spain being this really powerful nation. It's one of the first nations to explore and establish colonies, but not understanding the economics of it really started to put Spain on kind of a downward path in terms of its power and prestige. The price revolution also hurt different groups differently. So landowners, who were often nobles, had contracts with their serfs. that dictated certain things. And so they, in their contracts, said the serfs owe them this so much money. But as prices change and as inflation changes, they were not able to change how much they charged the serfs in rent because of these contracts that they already had. So people that were locked into a feudal contract did not do well. Landowners who were not locked into a contract, who could just kind of do whatever they wanted and adjust their prices, would do well because they could increase rents as inflation occurred. Middle-class merchants and manufacturers, they generally benefited. Anybody who had actual like stuff to sell or products that they produced who could sell them would benefit because prices were going up and they could make more money. Peasants were generally hurt. So the vast majority of peasants who lived at a subsistence level, they couldn't afford any kind of rise in price. And so it definitely caused economic problems for peasants and hunger for their families. So a little background on banking and money lending. In the Middle Ages, money lending, also called usury, was restricted by the Catholic Church. It was seen as really dishonorable and even sinful to lend money with interest. So that was very much against Catholic teachings. There also was not much money in circulation in Europe. Most Europeans relied heavily on the barter system, and they did not have a full-scale money economy like we do today. And so the Age of Exploration changes that, because the Age of Exploration led to all this gold and silver becoming available, and so now that's available to make coins out of and increase currency. This also allowed the middle class to be able to do what we call hoard capital. Capital is money that you could use to start a business. So like saving up and then getting a building or paying some workers, buying some materials, whatever things you would need to start a business. The fact now that Europe returns to a money economy means that people can actually hold money. Like if you don't have money, actual physical currency, it's kind of hard to save in this time period. And so having this return to a money economy allowed people to save, which is really important, and allowed people to be able to save to start new businesses, which led to capitalism taking off. So capitalism is simply when an entrepreneur, who is a person who takes a risk by investing capital in a new business venture, hopes to make a profit. So entrepreneurs attempt to start businesses. Not all businesses are successful, but they hope to do it and make a profit. Many European families entered this new industry of banking. The Medici family, which we learned about in Florence, is an example. They were heavily involved in banking, even had the Pope's accounts in their bank. Another one is the Fugger family from Germany. They made money in mining and began lending money to important people such as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V. So all of these things, banking, investing, saving money, didn't really come about in Europe until this time period where we have this huge expansion of European economies throughout the world. This was also a time of lots of growth of towns and cities. So the population recovered to what it had been before the Black Death, and we saw even went beyond that. And a lot of people were moving back to cities and towns, whereas in the Middle Ages, not a lot of people lived in cities and towns. As more and more people came into town, cities had to deal with new issues, such as sanitation and disease, unemployment, like how are we going to provide for the poor people within our city, poverty, and crime. So now that so many people are living together, those become issues that cities actually have to grapple with. And cities attempted to make laws to govern daily life, which is something that they hadn't really had to do before. There's a question here that I didn't realize I still kept. That's from the way the units used to be organized, so don't worry about that question, because we'll learn about Protestant Reformation soon. So in the Middle Ages, people who produced things were usually organized into guilds. Guilds governed commerce. Guilds were organizations of people who produced the same product, like a blacksmith's guild or a bricklayer's guild or a baker's guild. They produced things on an as-needed basis, again, because they didn't have this hard currency or much of it in the economy. They didn't really have the money to buy up a bunch of stuff, and so they just would produce things when they had an order and when people wanted them. The commercial revolution totally changed that, because now that people are wanting to produce things and then sell them overseas and trade them with a colony or another country, you kind of have to put up money to be able to do that. And so this requires what we call a capital investment, or you're going to have to invest money into your business to help it grow. And so entrepreneurs broke away from the guild system and hired people to go work in the countryside. Everything was still handmade, so I don't want you to think that this is a time period of industrialization or anything like that. But they start to be able to hire more workers to be able to help them produce stuff. And where some of the workers are available is out in the country. And so merchants hiring workers who are able to pay people to produce products start to become really wealthy. Some of the new elites of this time period were these merchants and also bankers. This is different from previous times like the Middle Ages in Europe, where the elites tended to be people with a hereditary title like a noble. So it used to be that those were the elites who had a title and owned land. Now there is this whole group of people who are self-made and are wealthy just because of their business opportunities and not because of anything hereditary that's been passed down to them. New industries that became really important at this time. I guess they're not really new, but they just became really important in this time and expanded. Mining, printing, cloth manufacturing, like think about all the cotton that was grown in North America, and shipbuilding. So as banking grew, there were new institutions or like new organizations and ideas. So just a few examples. The Bank of Amsterdam was one of the first to issue paper money, and we know that banking became important as a way for people to have a safe place to store their money. They're one of the first to issue paper money in Europe. The Bourse, which is one of the earliest stock exchanges, opened in Antwerp, Belgium in the 1500s. And so now companies could sell stock to get investments in their company. That's why companies sell stock, is you basically are selling a portion of your business, but in return for that, you're getting money injected into your business. And so this was a place where people could buy and sell shares of companies and exchange currency. This also led to the need to have better accounting and understand where your money is going. Because now that people are operating sometimes very large businesses, they need a way to track all of that. And they need to have records of their transactions of business. And so I'm not going to really explain double entry bookkeeping to you because it can get kind of complicated. But basically, this is modern accounting, where we're going to have like a ledger, or in their case, it would be like a piece of paper or a book, where we're going to track, okay, here's all of our expenses, and here's all the money that came into our business. So that might sound obvious to us, but this was a newer concept that this became widespread, and it's called double entry bookkeeping because you're keeping both sides of where the money is coming and going. Something that was new that you might already be familiar with were joint stock companies. This is when investors who wanted to sponsor overseas voyages or overseas trade would pool their money together and invest in a journey or a project. The advantage of this is all investors would share in the profit, but also the loss. So if you lost money, if like say you sponsored a voyage somewhere and then the ship sank, you would, yes, lose money, but it would definitely be less than if you had sponsored the whole thing by yourself. The Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company were wildly profitable joint stock companies that especially traded throughout Asia. And you can see a few facts here about them. One thing I want to emphasize is that the joint stock companies were given extraordinary powers by their governments. So we don't usually think of private businesses as having some of these powers, like the ability to wage war, the ability to coin money, the ability to take captives. But the Dutch government, for example, basically told the Dutch India Company, you go over to Southeast Asia and you do whatever is necessary to make us successful and profitable in Southeast Asia. If you have to kill some people, enslave some people, no problem. You gotta do what you gotta do to make this successful. So they were given extraordinary powers by the government. And then another new institution was insurance. So Lloyd's of London was one of the first major insurance companies to issue coverage in exchange for payment to lessen the risk of a business investment. And this is something that is just normal to us today. I mean, we have car insurance, businesses have all types of liability insurance, but this was a new idea in the 1600s that you could purchase insurance to protect your investments. Okay, the increase in trade and commerce also spurred new economic theories. And I think mercantilism is probably familiar to most people because of previous history classes that you've been required to take. But I'll just review it. So, basic beliefs of mercantilism: wealth should be stored in gold and silver, like that was the true measure of wealth, gold and silver. A country should strive to have a favorable balance of trade, where they are exporting more products than they're importing. A nation should be self-sufficient, so they should strive not to rely on any other countries. And the amount of wealth in the world is finite. So they believed that there was a limited amount of wealth in the world. Therefore, if they believe this, you need to compete to be able to get your share of that wealth. And so this led countries to establish overseas colonies and import gold and silver from other places. And it led to very, very intense rivalries between these countries as they competed for these resources that they believed to be finite. And to have a favorable balance of trade, to export more than you import, they did this by taking raw materials from their colonies and turning them into finished products. They also then would sell those finished products back to the colonies. So a good example of this is like lumber was imported from the 13 colonies back to Great Britain. In Great Britain, they turned that lumber into things like furniture and then made the colonists buy it from them. So the colonists weren't able to trade with anyone else other than Great Britain. All right, so what are the effects of this system? It led to very intense competition for resources and land among European nations, which led to lots and lots of war, because they believed that resources were finite and that they needed to compete aggressively to gain those for their country. It also led to lots of spending on the military to be able to maintain these huge empires and be able to kind of ward off attacks from other empires trying to take their territory. It also meant that they put very high tariffs on foreign products. So they wanted to protect their own industries, and so they put a high tariff on imports of foreign goods to encourage people to buy goods within the country. It also greatly increased the wealth and power of monarchs, especially this importation of the gold and silver. Agriculture during this time became more commercialized. Most people were still subsistence farmers, but serfdom was dying out in Western Europe. The problem, though, is that most people who were serfs and now peasants still had to pay rent, like they didn't own their own land. As landlords tried to increase rents and restrict rights, peasants often revolted. And large landowners worked to increase their land holdings. They brought new land under cultivation, like draining swamps. They developed new techniques where they started specializing in certain crops. And they also used the three-field system of crop rotation, like in the picture. The idea of that system is that they would divide their fields into three and then rotate every few years which field was left fallow or unplanted in order to replenish the nutrients in the soil, which was a more productive system than they had been doing before. And so as an example, England increased their crop yields by 30% by using these different steps. So large landowners worked to increase their land holdings. Landowners increased rents. They made shorter leases on land, and they started charging extra fees. Enclosure was also a change in agriculture that had a huge impact. So previously, most villages had a commons, which was a piece of land in the middle of the town or the village that anybody could use who didn't have land. Like maybe if you're poor, you can have a little garden and grow some food for your family. What they started doing in Europe, especially England, is getting rid of that and just selling off the commons to the highest bidder. This meant that the wealthy landowners were able to buy even more land, and now the poor, who previously had only had access to that common land, now had access to almost no land. These changes did not occur in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe continued with serfdom as the norm and the traditional nobility dominating. So even though that Western Europe was moving on to this new type of economy, that was not happening as quickly in Eastern Europe.